The companies that have been vulnerable over the last year that activists have been looking at are now even more vulnerable because the markets are a little more unstable. So I think that's going to cause more activism.
Hello, I'm John Grau, editor-in-chief of CorpGov. Happy to be here in New Orleans with our friend John Grau. John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, John, so much to talk about. You and I in the green room just now were discussing all this action in the news. Tell us what's cooking for the 2025 proxy season.
I think it's going to be busier than even last year, which was super busy. There's so much going on with DEI issues, what's happening with ISS, ignoring or dropping their DEI requirements. However, Glass Lewis is just sticking with their policies from last year. What's going to be super interesting is that it's really unknown how institutional investors will be voting on certain proxy issues and looking at boards of directors with respect to diversity, unless you do advance identification of how these investors vote. So there's just going to be a lot of uncertainty with regards to expectations on support for directors this year.
Well, John, you're making me think of something, if I can follow up on that. Is the influence of Glass Lewis and ISS going to be as strong as it was historically? Or are investors going to think more on their own? I mean, the thing is, it's expensive, right? To have a department to analyze, all those decisions. That's why they, more or less farm it out, right? And rely on them. So what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think that there will always be the investors who will, contract with and rely on the ISS and Glass Lewis recommendations. And, you see often many investors will work with ISS. I see that a little bit more than I see Glass Lewis, although Glass Lewis is a very influential force. More investors than ever are voting on a case-by-case basis, even when they do receive or review at least the ISS and Glass Lewis recommendations. So it's really important to know how every investor does vote, even if they are subscribers to ISS and Glass Lewis. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote that way during a proxy season.
Makes sense. Let's talk about the small cap universe. So say the Russell 2000 kind of companies.
Yeah.
Are they going to be targets more so this year than they were last year and years past?
Yeah, I think so. And I think they're even a little more vulnerable. Well, first of all, let me back up and say that it's kind of a wild equity market we're in right now. Who knows what to expect in terms of company valuations? Whether it's today, the market's down, tomorrow it could be up. So with respect to activism, you just don't know where the valuations are going to be. Now, 2-3 weeks from now, they're going to change dramatically. We could have a large drop in the market. However, the companies that have been vulnerable over the last year that activists have been looking at are now even more vulnerable because the markets are a little more unstable. So I think that's going to cause more activism. I think with the new administration, I think that just is allowing people to think more about activism. They believe the floodgates could be open a little bit more, less regulation.
Yeah.
And I also think a third layer, like we just mentioned, is the DEI component. And that just means that it doesn't open the door directly to activism, but it just means that there are more uncertainties with respect to what the voting will be during the proxy season.
That's interesting, John, because what I see when, the VIX is spiking and so on, the market's, I think, down for the year. Last I checked, it's whipping around a lot. That's not good for IPOs, and I don't think it's good for M&A. So it's kind of interesting to me that it's actually good for activism. Am I reading this properly?
Right. I mean, I'm expecting that there'll be less M&A activism this year, and that there's just going to be more pure operational activism. And, we'll certainly see a lot of governance-related activism, a lot of just pure, operational activism, and probably a little bit less on the M&A side.
Well, John, not to be political here, but what I see with Elon Musk is a little bit of activism in our own government, right? So are you saying that could stoke, inspiration among people who see poorly run companies in the sense that Elon thinks that virtually every department of the U.S. government is poorly run?
That's right. That's right. I think it's very possible. I think that it just adds to a layer of instability, and depending upon what Elon, not to be political, but it depends upon what Elon or others in the government decide to do next, and kind of how the markets react, and that could be open the gates towards more potential activism.
Well, all right. So to give your firm some credit, InvestorCom's job is to identify shareholders, reach out to them, and so on. Should companies that think they might become a target work harder at getting to know their shareholders in this environment?
That is more important now than ever before, for a couple of reasons. Even those companies who feel that they're not a target for activism need to know who their shareholders are, need to know who the non-13F filers are.
Yeah.
They need to know how their shareholders vote, what their ISS and Glass Lewis affiliations are.
Yeah.
And to the extent they may subscribe to ISS but don't vote directly per ISS, they need to know that. They need to know what hedge funds are moving in and out of the stock. So what we do is called stock surveillance. That's more important now than it's ever been before. So kind of being more proactive in knowing your shareholders, knowing how they move in and out of the stock, that is really kind of top line priority for our corporate clients.
Gotcha. John, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball here. Do these tariffs have any impact on your universe? I mean, cross-border stuff with Canada is where we see a lot of action. Does this complicate matters, or do you think we could still see cross-border activism action?
No, I still think we'll see cross-border activism for sure. And I mean, speaking of tariffs, because we're not being political,
right?
But speaking of tariffs, I think that any fluctuations in prices is affecting the market. It's just going to keep stirring the pot for what could come throughout the year with any future activism, and how that affects public companies, and quite frankly, how that can affect investor sentiment, because particularly as I deal with smaller cap companies, and many of those companies having retail shareholders, perhaps the angrier they are, or perhaps the more frustrated they are as consumers who own public companies, that could affect. And and a lot of these individuals aren't necessarily sophisticated with corporate governance policies, but they may just be unhappy that their company isn't doing well, or that will affect how they vote as shareholders. And maybe one shareholder vote won't count, but in mass, that could have some influence on the overall voting outcomes.
Well, John, I think we had a really nice line of thought here, because what you've told me is that while other aspects of Wall Street are going to be subdued, right? Like, as I said, M&A and IPOs, your world's going to be busy as ever this year, right? So is that your prediction?
Yes, it is. My busy schedule is already showing that.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us here in New Orleans at the Tulane conference. I'm John Janarone of CorpGov, here with John Grau, who is the president and CEO of InvestorCom.